Chapter 10. Panic at the Community College. The next day, the day of the exam that is, Dixie woke up realizing he had only 20 minutes to reach the transit bus to get to school. It was early. Too early for Dixie. His head was still clouded, and his eyes stung in the morning light. Normally at times like this, he would wake up with a sleep hangover. It was a term he would use to describe himself after 3 days straight of unfitful sleep. As he lay there in bed looking up at the ceiling for 5 minutes, he considered how sleep hangovers might explain the strange visions he thought he was having. Maybe they had finally caught up to him. Normally when his mind was too exhausted to care anymore, he would actually get a good night's sleep again. But when he'd get a sleep hangover, his dreams, recent visions aside, became especially bizarre. As he sat there eating breakfast, he was thinking about the dream he had just had last night. He had been hanging out in a park when all of a sudden a bunch of giant ducks were playing music in the background. The ducks played bongo drums, and suddenly they stood up and formed a conga line, shaking their butts as they jammed. Suddenly they all broke into an Irish sea shanty and money started pouring down from the sky. Dixie chuckled to himself with relief as he ate his bowl of cereal. At least that one was more normal, he thought to himself. The other recent ones he was having had been all too profound. It was as if a voice was speaking to him in his dreams, or something outside of his mind was invading them. Either way, it was just as well. His subconscious seemed to make up for the mundanity of this limbo existence all around him anyway. As he arrived at Tortuga Community College, Dixie swung himself lazily from the bus with his left arm and rounded the doorway so hard he almost hit his face against the open doors. His backpack slipped off his shoulder and he shrugged it back up as he walked into the college. Great gravity door, Dixie mumbled to himself softly as he leaned into the second set of double doors at the school entrance, pushing them open with his shoulder. He was greeted by stale air and a faint smell of deodorizer from the shipment of urinal cakes resting by the front lobby. The halls were empty. Shuffling through the halls on his way to the lecture hall, he found his mind wandering between a mix of scenes he could picture in his mind from the mysterious book that the vagabond had given him and the multiple dreams that were all coming back to him. This is just great, he muttered to himself. With a mind this muddled, he was in no condition to take this damn test. Looking at his feet, he noticed his laces were untied. They had likely been untied since he had jumped into them this morning. He hunched over and mounted a flight of stairs on his way to the lecture hall. Each step felt heavier than the last, so he paused to gather his wits. "Pucker up, man," he said to himself cheerfully. Or at least tried to, as he shook the cobwebs out of his head. Normally, Dixie knew that there seemed to be always a way to raise himself out of the most dire situations. Based on his own track record, it appeared that if all else, if he actually tried hard enough, he was charismatic enough usually in his own way to always bail out of a problem. Yeah, good luck. You might have had some luck, maybe before getting fired in the car. Maybe you depleted all of it. A more negative, almost whispering part of Dixie's brain seemed to remind himself as he kept walking. That was just great. Now his own mind seemed to be working against him. At least more than normal. That was just a bad week. The more cheerful part of Dixie's brain that he felt he had control of reasoned back out loud. Stupid lack of sleep. If someone had been spying on him at that moment, they would have thought he was on a Bluetooth or just downright insane. Hey, life is sinusoidal, Dixie continued cheerfully to himself out loud this time. Sinusoidal, just like the math exam. That's trig, though, not algebra, dum-dum. You bombed that too, a thought immediately countered within his head. Dixie groaned as he continued shuffling down the hall. Don't worry, he tried to convince himself. Everything should be all right in the end. If he had any strength, it was that mysteriously enough, things always seemed to work out for him out of sheer dumb luck. It was as if the cosmos would never let him catch a break, but it would never leave him in dire straits either. And if the situation was nearly life or death, fate had a way of cutting him just enough slack to keep him on a progressive path for some greater purpose, or at least from getting really screwed. One time last year after an ice storm, he had taken a walk in a certain forest and foolishly stood too close to the edge of a ravine which looked like the shape of a snake, and it happened to look over the Babayan River. It was a river stream that the Babain brothers used to love going on for hikes, and Dixie used to find a lot of solace in that place. Just a good place to get away most of the time. But this day had been particularly very cold, so cold that the land had frozen underneath, and there was ice all over the floor. Losing his footing, Dixie slid helplessly down the ravine, breaking branch after branch before he plunged into the river below. Fortunately, the water he plunged into was only 3 feet deep. Pulling himself out of the river with a branch, he sprinted back to his car before he succumbed to frostbite. His jeans turned to ice, and he ran for a mile in his underwear until a random motorist caught him on a secondary road and basically saved his life. There was almost always an embarrassing penalty for his stupitudes, but the point was that there was always a way out of these plights. Life is just puzzles. This shouldn't be any different, Dixie tried to convince himself. Besides, Professor Existi's got to be a reasonable guy. He'll probably appreciate how I spent this time unlocking the secret to the rat race we've been tricked into slaving into. He ought to. He's an academic, for crying out loud. He ought to thank me if he finally gets it. It's more important than this stupid math test. Yes, that was it. Charisma. The ticket to get out of most of these situations. Everyone seemed to underestimate this particular ability about him, and in Dixie's mind, it was a good thing he had it, for if he needed to butter up people, explaining himself out of a situation tactfully was everything. Dixie smiled as he rounded the last corner towards the corridor leading to the lecture hall. Charisma, man. Think charisma. Dixie tried to psych himself up. It was how he had been able to avoid paying the tolls off exit 10 for weeks, apparently. Arriving in the lecture hall, he was surprised to find it was packed. Where did half of these students come from? They'd never been in the class before. When he couldn't find a seat, he realized how late he really was. He looked up to find Professor Existi standing right next to him. Professor Existi was a 60-something, fit-looking man with a kind, intelligent face, a bald head, trimmed beard, and fashionable glasses. The professor taught a rigorous advanced algebra class, where there seemed to be very little time spent actually writing numbers on the blackboard. Instead, Professor Existi spent most of the class going off tangents about his glory days as the winner of the annual pumpkin tossing championships. He had proudly kept his title as champion chucker for 8 years straight as he hurled scores of pumpkins hundreds of feet in the air with the use of a giant slingshot. And because Professor Existi would constantly bring up stories about his claimed adventures in Ziana up north when he had worked at the ski resort on Mount Muhadeo as a young man, the thought of these mystical uncharted lands up north nearby flooded heavily on Dixie's mind right now. All this stuff about Anakaland, thanks to Esoteric Myths and Esoteric Places, Volume 3. Damn, I'm so tired, Dixie thought to himself, and he did a valiant job trying to initially keep his mind from daydreaming. Dixie then wrote his name on the test. The I and the E were too close to each other. He tried to add an I separate from the IE, but it became a mess. Using his eraser was a mistake. Now a giant smudge formed at the top of his paper. Twirling his pencil back to the lead end, Dixie tried to write his name more carefully, this time next to the smudge. Damn, Dixie thought to himself. He was already bombing this exam, forfeiting all the points he got for just writing his name. Chili Sue never had this problem. Her writing was carefully practiced and impeccable. But where was Chili Sue? Dixie looked around and realized she was even later than him. Now that's a first, he thought. He stared at his math exam. True or false? Brackets 6y to the negative second times x cubed, all to the negative third, equals 6 to the negative third times y to the sixth times x to the negative ninth, which equals y to the sixth divided by 6 cubed times x to the ninth, which equals y to the sixth divided by 216 times x to the ninth. Dixie started to get nervous and knew he needed a lifesaver. Fatigue was kicking in. Wouldn't it be great if we lived in a world where when you got startled, your hat would fly off your head just like in the comics? A thought went in his mind. There he went again, trying to keep himself from panicking and thinking at random of anything, really, that would at least lighten his mood a little, if not help him solve the math problems. His attention waned once again, and he remembered that conversation he had had with Chili Sue recently. She had looked so frustrated. Something about how all the good humanitarian jobs that do positive things in society were the ones that didn't pay. Why can't we just live in a world that respects noble like social work or teaching more instead of paying high salaries to professions that are making the world more and more complicated? She asked him. If that was the case, I think I'd want to be a cooper, he had replied. What's a cooper? She had asked. A guy that makes barrels. That wouldn't make any money anyways, Chili Sue had said. And what's so noble about being a barrel maker? I don't know. Rodeo clowns? Wine storage? It would too be a noble job, he had retorted facetiously. I think I really would like to be a cooper, he said softly to himself, as he just kept staring at the paper over and over, trying to make sense of it. The word 35 minutes was written in a marker on the whiteboard when he glanced up. Dixie balked and began to sweat. He looked around in alarm and cried out to the universe, once again hoping that something would magically help him. He noticed Chili had finally arrived, and when their eyes met, she gave him the same helpless stare he would give her before he would get on a roller coaster. He stared at his math exam again. The next problem said, solve for the missing variable in 2/9 times x plus 3/9 equals negative 1/9 times x plus 2. He tried to think, but nothing happened. Dixie figured he'd try his luck further down the test. Isolate for x, he muttered to himself. Next problem. Negative 8 times x plus 1 is less than or equal to 2x. Dixie skimmed through the test and realized the problems were not going to get any easier. He had hit a wall. If only there was a proverbial exit out of this mess. Maybe there was an opening. It was just hard to open, like the great gravity door. Great gravity door, he mumbled again, dreamingly. According to esoteric myths, no one who had encountered the great gravity door had ever returned to tell their tale. If someone drove through the speed traps of Pipiti's Nice past Mount Muhideo, the great gravity door would appear. Or maybe it was at going to Mount Muhideo. He couldn't remember. Somewhere up there, he mumbled to himself out loud. Of course, with gas prices the way they were, no one really tried. Not to mention it was just too dangerous to go up into that forsaken desert. The word 20 minutes was now written on the whiteboard. Dixie hadn't solved a single problem on his exam. He felt trapped. His palms were sweating, and his pencil slid from his grasp. He could feel pinpricks on the back of his neck. He blushed. The room started to swim. His breathing was fast and loud in his ears. His mouth was like sandpaper. Was this a panic attack? Dixie had to get out of here. Professor Existi, Dixie called out loud as he wobbled towards the professor. His neck was stiff. May I use the bathroom? Sure, the professor nodded. He would only be a minute. Leaving his stuff behind, he walked in a stupor out of the room. As soon as he stepped into the hallway, his vision cleared. He leaned against the wall and his panic subsided. As his mental functions returned, he realized the trip would not have to be in vain. He did in fact need the services of the laboratory. Taking a deep breath, he dragged his feet the few steps down the hall towards his destination. Dixie opened the door and stumbled onto the strangest sight. Right there in the middle of the men's room was a purple, large, swirling portal.